I don't get invited to very many parties because of the topic that I talk about, so thank you very much, Jess. I'll be there. Could I just indulge just a show of hands for those who worry about climate change to any level? Just keep your hands up and have a little glance around. Gosh, thank you. So I live in this data every day, and I live in the data that doesn't show up on the mainstream news or on social media. It's the crushing stuff. It's the tears at the dinner table stuff. And if I hadn't found pathways to hope, I wouldn't be here today. So I'm going to share some of that with you. You're probably familiar with the boiling frogs metaphor. The story goes that if you put a frog in a pot of cold water, I don't know how the frog got in there or why the frog's there, but the frog's in the pot of cold water and we put it on the stove, it just very gradually turn up the heat. And because of the gradual change, the frog doesn't notice that it's getting too hot and it eventually dies and the water boils. Scientifically not true. The frogs aren't stupid. When it gets too hot, they hop out. But the metaphor has been useful over the last 60 years for when we talk about business change and cultural change. Small changes made consistently over time tend to be more successful. So for business and culture, it's a great metaphor. For climate change, it starts to become a problem. Now, I remember 30 years ago when I started, that was the metaphor we used. How do we end up being a culture that just walks around like this? When did that happen? It just crept up on us, we got used to it. The problem being with the metaphor for climate change is that climate change isn't changing, it isn't happening in a linear fashion. It's full of turning points, tipping points, crashing ecosystems, catastrophic events. We're already being socially and economically mugged by climate change. We're just lurching from one disaster to the next. So it's no surprise that our language around climate adaptation tends to be one of disaster preparedness, disaster response, and I get that. So part of what I'm here to do today is to help us lift our language out of that space. So before we talk about this new language, let's check in on our glossary. So I'm going to enlist your imagination here to draw a visual. So it's a simple Venn diagram, 2 circles. And on your left, it's a big blue circle called mitigation. And it's full of heaps of things that you probably recognise. Renewable energy, forest plantations, energy efficiency, electrification. Lots of great things in this big blue circle, mitigation. So these are all about reducing carbon emissions, pulling carbon out of the biosphere and the atmosphere, starting to try to solve the problem. That's mitigation. The other circle, that's a blue circle. Let's make this one yellow. It's called adaptation. It's all the things that we now must do because we haven't been working hard enough on that side over decades. So we now must adapt to the fact that climate change is already locked in no matter what we do here. Yeah? And there are lots of things in the adaptation circle that we must be acting on right now. Where things get really interesting is in the middle here, at the intersection of the 2 circles. Mitigation plus adaptation. Blue plus yellow equals, see how clever I was there, green. And there are hundreds of things in these circles that we could do, and it's really difficult at the moment to navigate through, to know what to latch onto, isn't it? But in the middle, if we have limited time, I've got very limited time, limited resources and finite capital, where in these circles should we put our energy? Into the best bang for buck, into the middle, generally. So I'm going to give you 3 examples, or 3 provocations of how we can do that. And I'll do this through 3 lenses. You've heard some of them already. I'm an architect and advisor, 30 years in the game. When I started, way back in the early 90s, last century, the payback on solar panels was 90 years. We were excited when it came down to 80 years payback. I'll speak through my research background at the Uni of New South Wales. So I research within the City Futures Research Centre. And I'm researching ways in which our cities might be able to produce food for us under extreme climate change conditions in the future. And I'll also speak through my startup background. So I'm the founder of a startup called Climatewise Villages, where we are decanting all of that knowledge and experience into a startup that is developing the next generation of climate-ready living. Deeply sustainable, deeply healthy, nature-positive, regenerating landscape. And my goal for all of this is to change our climate adaptation language into one of hope. The first provocation is that adaptation must become synonymous with abundance. And Jess has given you a little bit of an insight into what that might look like already. By abundance, I mean abundant fresh water, clean air, abundant safe food, abundant renewable energy, nature, even abundant social well-being. Are these not things that we all want, that we all yearn for? And we can actually connect all of these things in one circular living system if we design things well. So I'm just going to pick one of the elements out of that, which is a community energy system. So by community, I mean, for example, a collection of people living in an apartment, could be a hotel, collection of apartment buildings, could be a university campus, a school, hospital, even our neighbourhoods and towns, communities. And what we can do now with community energy systems is have homes and buildings covered in solar panels, all networked with each other through local wiring, inverters, charging batteries for homes and cars. We can effectively have our own grid. So even when the main grid might suffer a disaster or a catastrophe due to a climate-driven event, could be a storm, could be a bushfire or a flood, that community has a better chance of continuing to operate, as do the businesses inside it. So what we're building now is an energy grid that is working really hard in the blue circle and is also adapted to climate risk. So it's sitting right there in the middle. Why wouldn't we want more of that? And I believe the capital is already out there to achieve that. I often hear clients say, well, we can't afford that. We actually can't afford not to. If a building collapses, if a building has to shut down during a climate event, it can take many months to bounce back. Sometimes it's long enough for that business to die. So investing in this proactive adaptation is money well spent. So a provocation for you, what could you do in your community to retrofit for abundance? Let's change that language. The next one is directed into the boardroom, where I spend some of my time. One of the biggest risks for an organisation is in the transition space. What we mean by transition is the transition to a carbon-constrained economy or changing supply chain, shifting governance and customer expectations. Have you heard the term green hushing? It's different to greenwashing, which is all the BS that we have to try and navigate through at the moment. Green hushing is what we're seeing more and more companies do because they're so worried about accusations of greenwash. They're worried about customer backlash. They're worried about what the media is saying about all of these net zero schemes not working. So a lot of companies are actually backpedaling on sustainability commitments or even dropping their net zero targets. So my provocation here is to hold the line on net zero. There isn't a company around that can't achieve net zero without having to rely on some form of carbon offsets. But the thing is, carbon offsets, they're just a tool. Tools can be used to do harmful things, or they can be used to be helpful. So an example of a carbon offset tool that might be harmful, one that I'm aware of, converts agricultural produce, think of that as crops, into aviation fuel for the aviation industry, even when 1 in 5 Australians are currently experiencing food poverty. So I'd say that's probably not a good outcome of a net zero scheme. On the other hand, there are products off the shelf already that invest carbon offsets in land restoration, restoring habitat through Indigenous land care groups all over Australia, creating local jobs and skills, local economy, empowering, restoring landscape, connected with country. A good use of the tool. So the provocation here is to hold the line on net zero, but adapt it if you need to, towards nature. Nature is the greatest sponge for carbon. You know, something like 90%, 97% of a tree is carbon from the air, not from the ground. So nature draws carbon out of the atmosphere. The third and final provocation is one that affects all of us. It's to do with the system, the one system that has more greenhouse emissions than all of the world's cars, trucking, shipping, aviation, and the fashion industry combined. More emissions than all the buildings on Earth. In fact, this particular system is responsible for around 1/3 of the global climate and biodiversity crisis, let's say 33%. Yet we only allocate 3% of global adaptation funding to this system. Can you guess what it is? We're all part of it. It's the food that goes on our plates, the food system. And it's fascinating, and it's no wonder that I've gravitated towards this space over 30 years, because it's got the biggest levers for us yet to start pressing in acting on climate and biodiversity. And I think probably because it's a system that just falls between the chairs. Who's responsible for the food system? We have a role to play. So my provocation here is to target food on your plate that has no fossil fuel fertilisers, no fossil fuel pesticides, using local produce as much as you can. So there's an army now, a growing cohort of small and medium scale farmers around Australia who are relearning these age-old techniques of producing food sustainably by not using fossil fuels, by electrifying their farms, restoring soils, regenerating landscape. The one thing they need the most from us is our business. So I'm going to set a challenge for you, and this is a really, really tough challenge. I always like to leave people with some homework. Next time you get the chance, for one day, just one day, I used to say a week and people couldn't do it, I couldn't do it. Just for one day, eat only certified organic, seasonal, locally grown, locally produced food and have zero food waste. It's really, really tough because of the system that we're stuck in. But we all have a role to play. Every time we buy food, we're a data point. Data moves mountains. When you finally do succeed in that challenge, then ask yourself, how do I amplify that? How do I amplify that to my home, to my office, to my campus? How do I amplify that through my planning system, through design controls, to start to shift the dial? It's a tough challenge, food for thought. So let's come back to our diagram to finish off. We've got the blue circle, mitigation, yellow circle, adaptation. With limited time and resources, let's focus on, most of the focus should be in the middle. And I gave you 3 provocations. One was to adapt for abundance. Let's lift the language into abundance. The next was to adapt net zero towards nature. Nature can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And the third was to eat for planetary health. So I do believe that climate adaptation will become a new normal, whether we like it or not. This is the situation we've set ourselves up for. But we still have time to choose between bunkers and abundance. So thank you for listening. I hope I haven't dragged you down too far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Digby. Some really powerful calls to action there that I think we'll all be reflecting on following your talk. Thank you. Sitting behind stage, I'm a writer myself. You've spent 30 years up to your elbows in the deep science and data in this area, and I thought it was incredibly fascinating that you have such a strong focus on language. So, Digby, when we think about getting people to grasp new normals, what do you think is the balance between making them think and making them feel?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually think we need both. So yes, finding the balance is right. I think we heard yesterday that if we just argue to people's hearts, it hasn't gotten us there. We've been trying that. I've been trying that for 30 years. And it works to an extent. It might get people in the tent, but it doesn't get them to buy. The other side, and this is where I think we're in the situation now where it's starting to move our action, is on things like insurability. So if you live in a township that's exposed to climate risk, you're already paying for higher insurance, if you can get insurance at all. So, for example, our insurance industry is already moving us away from climate risk, whether we like it or not. So it's actually a bit of both. If we stay on the front foot with this, we can still have businesses based on growth, and I don't know that the word sustainable growth really does work, but we can try. So it is a balance of both.
Beautiful. Yep. I love that invitation to take this opportunity so that we can have the balance of both and seek abundance in this area. One more question, Digby. I I was like, is this a fair question? But I'm going to ask you anyway, because I think that you have this incredible ability to hold on to hope. Could you tell me a moment that you experienced recently in your work that made you feel hopeful?
I'm pausing because I really have to go back a while. Okay, here's an example. So I've sitting on a lot of design review panels across local and state government, so I get to review other architects' work, which is a really enjoyable part of my job. And just in the space of 18 months, I've seen one local Sydney council go from, what do you mean we have to have green infrastructure or we should worry about heat risk in the urban environment? They've gone from that 18 months later to rewriting their entire design control for every building in their city because of those discussions 18 months ago. So change can happen really fast. And that's why I made the point that each one of us are actually a data point. We can, if we all push in the same direction, we can actually move things very quickly. So when I'm seeing examples of that where, oh, that was something I said 18 months ago. So it does work. Speaking up does work.
Amazing.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Digby.
Thank you.